The kit contains all of these parts. The castings are all fully machined. You have the head casting, weighs 90 pounds. You have the guide castings, the guide mounting plate, a set of plans with a list of all the parts, the set screws and the lock nuts, bearings for the various pivoting points that you're going to machine in the parts you make, the pins that go in those points, a heavy-duty die spring that goes into the push rod, and the main springs that return the head. You're looking at the bottom part of the frame. This is stuff that you're going to have to collect in order to complete your hammer. So the plans call for the base plate here to be made out of 1 by 12 inch. You could use a square piece of plate, would work just as well. The back column, the plans call for 6 inch. This one is 7 inch. And the little extra room makes it a lot easier to assemble things inside. You can just barely get things together with a 6 inch. The front tubing is 6 inch square tubing with 1/2 inch wall. Heavier wall would work better. Heavier is better on an anvil. The top of the anvil base is comprised of an assortment of square bar and flat bar to complete this section with a slot through the middle and a hardy hole in it to allow you to put anvil tooling and stuff in it. All of these parts, along with the gussets at the bottom, can be installed on the plate and welded together according to the dimensions on the plans. When you get to the upper part, that's a little different story. At this point, we don't have this welded on yet. What we want to do is get the head to line up centered over the anvil base. And so to do that, usually put something in the slot here to keep your peg you're going to put in here from dropping through. Depending on the size of your hardy hole, you want a piece of tubing. Square tubing is pretty accurate, so it makes it a real good way to get this stuff centered. This one's 1 inch, I'll put 1 inch on there. The heads come with an 1.25 inch hole in them for tooling. So I can just leave an 1.25 inch over 1 inch and they fit pretty well depending on the wall thickness. This is the upper section of the frame. You're looking at the upper support, the guide mounting plate, the gussets that hold the arm, the pivots to raise and lower the head. And assembling this is a little tricky because you want the head to travel straight and be centered on the anvil, so you can't just weld it together. You can take your head and slide it down over there. And usually there's a little bit of play, but you're going to be pretty well centered. So we're supposed to be positioning this upper support so that the head stays in the right relationship with the anvil. It's a little bit tricky to show that with this already in place. What we do is take the guide mounting plate, and usually we bolt it to this piece with this loose. We clamp a piece of angle iron under here just to kind of hold it in rough position. Normally, the back of the guide is bolted to the support arm before we put it into this position. We will clamp a piece of angle iron to the tube in the back to help hold that up in position. Put this up here, and then we put the guides, the bolt holes that correspond to the slots here. We mount that onto the guide, or the hammer. Pull it up so it's fairly snug. Once you get both of the guides on there, you want to clamp them on the head so they're very snug. Once the guides are snugged to the head, get them centered. You can move it back and forth with the little set screws that are going to be on here. That allows you to move the back of the support arm to get the head perfectly centered and squared with the anvil base. At this point, we have the support arm securely fastened to the head with the guides, and it allows us now to move this up and down, whatever, in order to get the head to hit square and lined up, centered on the anvil base. When I put this angle iron on, I usually mount it just a little lower than I think it should be. That allows me to be able to move the arm up with a wedge. So I make a tapered wedge, a piece of anything, put it in here. It's easy to tap it with a hammer and get very minute increments of adjustment. Put the upper gussets on. The easiest way is to put a spacer in here, 1.25 inch square tubing for a spacer. Piece on the bottom so it's lined up centered on the arm here. Put another piece vertically in the back so that they're square. And then you want to put a 3/4 inch pin or the bolt you're going to use, 2 holes to make sure they're lined up. At this point, you can tack these in place. When you go to weld it, you want to take any clamps and things on here that you might have on here off, because you want to let this spread apart at the top here where the pivot is. When you mount that arm in here, you can always pull it together with the bolt to snug it down a little bit, but it's really difficult to get them to spread apart. Gussets at the bottom are done the same way. They're spaced different, they're 2 1/4, but you put a spacer in the bottom, have a vertical one standing up, put a pin through the holes to make sure they're lined up correctly, tack them in place, and take off any clamps or anything you have on there so that they can spread a little bit too. You can always pull it together with a bolt. When you receive the head, this pin is already installed. So you have to remove it in order to install the connecting rod. Okay? It has a hole through it. There's a bolt that goes through that to hold it in place. On the end, it's got a screwdriver slot to allow you to turn it back and forth to line up the hole. Because putting these holes in is never exactly centered, you want to make sure you know which side is the top so you can put it back in with the top up. This is the connecting rod. You get a drawing for this, but you have to build it. So, in the bottom it has a 3/4 inch hole aligned with that pin, and one of those bushings you get goes in that hole. You want to put a grease fitting on it, and when you mount this in here, make sure the grease fitting is pointed out. Push the pin through the connecting rod so it's connected. Then we're going to put a bolt through here, that holds the pin in place. It's a 5/16 Allen head bolt, goes in that hole. Before I put the pin in, I usually put a little grease on it. I usually put a little grease on these too. Just facilitates taking it apart down the road if you ever need to. Getting the hole lined up for this is what that screwdriver slot is for, because if it's turned, you're obviously not going to get this in the hole. It should go in all the way until it's a little below the surface of the head. The hole in the head for the pin is different size on each side. Obviously the one size of the hole, or the pin. On the opposite side, it's a smaller hole. That's just there to allow you to be able to drive the pin out down the road if you ever need to remove it. This is the treadle. It's another part you're going to make. You get a full set of drawings for this. So you have this U-bracket that goes around the anvil. The arm goes into the back. This is the bushing it pivots on. In the back it connects to the connecting rod that will go up to the head. The treadle or pedal or whatever on the front you want to call it is loose because you need this off in order to get this threaded in around the anvil base. This is the connecting rod. At the top you have a saddle there that will accept the arm. A 1.25" round bar down to the bottom. At the bottom there's a piece of DOM tubing. This is the DOM tubing, and the bottom part of the connecting rod or push rod goes into this with a spring. The lower part of the push rod slides inside of the DOM tubing. I use DOM tubing so there's not a lot of slop. Okay, there's a spring in here, and this allows the push rod to take up shock and not transfer it into your leg. I start off with a piece that's a little longer. I can upset the end that way to form the bottom eye, and then when I slide it in, I'm going to be able to end up with 57 inches from this eye to the top eye. If it's a little long, you can trim it off. If it's a little short, you're in trouble. These are the parts for the spring assembly. You have the tensioning rod here, the spring tensioning block, and the springs. The top of the springs with this flat plate fit inside this slot on the block. Then you put a bolt through the hole in there in order to hold them in place. So it's a tensioning rod. You want to screw it in so it's at least halfway or, through the block. In order to tension the springs up, after this is assembled, it'll have a nut on the bottom end that you will turn, and it will continue to thread this up through this rod to tension the springs. So we have the arm, the spring assembly, and the push rod. We're going to put these all together before we put them into the back tube. So the hook comes with the springs. We're going to use that to attach the springs to the bottom of the arm. The push rod will attach to this opening at the back. That's the pivot point for the top of the push rod. So attach this to the push rod, get it lined up, and pin. Okay, to keep the bottom rod from falling out, you tie a piece of string around the top, and then we can remove that later after we get in the tube. You have the push rod in the back and the spring assembly in the front. Now, as you lower it down, that bracket that you welded on the inside of the tube here, that threaded rod goes through that bracket, and you double nut it on the bottom, and that allows you to tension the springs. Once you've double nutted the tension rod in there, then we want to hook the bottom of the push rod to the back end of the treadle. So the first thing you do is cut that string so that it doesn't in the way. And then you helps to have two people with this. You have to pick it up and kind of push it to the bottom. And push the pin through. So push the pin through the connecting rod in the back of the treadle, and then put on that snap ring to secure the pin. So now put the bolt through the treadle, secure the bolt. The nylock nut allows you to tension it so you can have a nice free-moving treadle without the nut vibrating loose down the road. It's got a little bit of play, but we can take that up with the bolt. Position the upper arm, get a bolt through it. The bolts I use for these are a lot longer than necessary because I want the part that's going through the bushing not to have any threads on it. So I buy a bolt where you have no threads all the way out into here someplace, and I can always trim off the extra threads after it's on. We have the spring connected in the back, the push rod's connected, get the bolt through the arm, time to put the head back on. So we'll bring it up here. It takes about 3 blocks in here, 3 pieces of 2x4 to space it up enough where you can get the connecting rod hooked to the arm. Okay. Standing on the treadle, pull the arm down, tilt the head out a little bit so you can tilt the connecting rod out and hook it to the arm. Run your pin through, put your snap ring on, and you're good to go. Depending on how much side-to-side slop in here, you shouldn't have much. You probably have to take this guide loose again in order to get the head back in position. So bolt this guide back on, put another guide on, and then it's time to start adjusting things. Now that we have it all basically assembled, it's time to adjust it. So to begin with, get the bolts back here hooking onto the guides so they're just finger snug. You don't want them pulling away from the guide plate. You want them to be able to move. We use these set screws here to be able to push the guides in, take out the slop in the hammer. It also allows you to get it roughly centered. You want it snug, but you don't want it so snug that it won't move. So once you get it adjusted, you may have to back it off just a hair. And then you want to tighten these nuts on the outside. That'll lock them in position so they don't tend to move, otherwise they'll just pretty much vibrate out. Once the head is all adjusted, tighten everything down, tighten the bolts in the back, make sure it still moves fairly freely. And then you're going to tension the spring to get this to come up to where you want it. To tension the spring, you can reach through the slot here to that double nut. An air ratchet is really nice for this, but you can just use a regular socket wrench. Get on here, and you just tighten it down until the head goes up to where you want it. Once the spring's tensioned, then you can play with the guides a little bit. Sometimes it's a little too snug and it doesn't move very well. Also, I found if you use real heavy oil on here, it tends to be really gummy and it doesn't slide very well. Something like WD-40 or sewing machine oil works really well. There's still the block down here, your spacer block you have to build and insert in the hardy hole. And then I also want to put a hardened, usually I use like 1/2x4, put a shank on it to attach at the top to give me a face on the top of the hammer. Other than that, you're ready to go.